But that's my thought. So there's the question of the day for all of you. When a university fails at its own mission and the administrators don't seem to be up to it or are entirely uninterested in holding to that principle of free and open inquiry that is argued for here, and again, I agree with it, what do you do? I've talked a lot on this show about the universities and things going on with them. Why? Because it is where we train the next generation of scientists. So it makes fully good things for us to talk about, since that's where we are, training them, and what goes on at the universities does influence what the next generation of scientists will look like, and more so how they'll behave and what behaviors, what kind of professional behaviors will we expect. And so there's pieces like this, and there is a very real debate in question, because there's plenty of documented survey data now at this point that talk about how students don't feel like they can speak their minds on campus, that they're afraid to, that cancel culture is a very real thing. It's not consequences culture, as much as some would claim to call it that. And so there comes a fair question at that point. If the universities themselves are failing at their own missions, to what degree do you then rely upon the state to help save it? Now, I like others, have been reticent to have the state involved in anything. Because again, smaller government is better as far as I'm concerned. So this piece in the magazine Inside Higher Education came to my attention, called The Wrong Remedy. Tony Banout asks if aggressive state and federal intervention will destroy higher education in a supposed attempt to save it. We'll go through this real quick, actually, as we get in here. The recurring drama is now well worn. The president of a leading university is subpoenaed before a legislative body and faces fierce, politically motivated questioning from members of Congress. They are forced to answer charges that their venerable institution, one of the world's finest, has fallen prey to ideological takeover, the rot of which is so profound that it can no longer meet its mission of teaching, learning, and spreading truth. The pursuit of the truth is really the correct one there, but neither here nor there right now. Such corrosion and decay demand government intervention. And it is a tale as old as time, actually. Well, at least as old as the universities have been formally in existence in the United States, at least. But the scene unfolds differently than the doom loop we seem to be experiencing in our own times. Against government regulation of what is said and taught at universities, this university leader articulates a time-tested truth. The policy of repression of ideas cannot work and has never worked. The alternative to it is the long, difficult road of education. Thus was the testimony of University of Chicago Chancellor Robert M. Hutchins in 1949 at the start of the McCarthy era, a time that ensnared many on suspicions of communism and disloyalty to the state, including academics like Harvard professor Helen Wendler Markham and, as Christopher Nolan recently reminded us, J. Robert Oppenheimer. Now the frontal attack on higher education alleges anti-Semitism run amok, and the failures of current diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. The question behind the contemporary Inquisition remains the same. Will aggressive state and federal intervention destroy higher education in the supposed effort to save it? Now, we're going to have to see on that, and I also wonder, in part, did the state inadvertently help such things happen? Why? Because some of these are public universities that we're talking about, and so they get direct taxpayer dollars in the form of budgets and what have you. And then others, of course, are competing for grants and dollars and what have you, in which at times certain things are tied to them that you have to account for. So I also question whether or not the state has a role in screwing things up at the universities at this point. Topic for another day, but just an interesting side note that I wanted to bring up here. It is true that some of the ways in which DEI initiatives operate on campuses have corroded free inquiry. Some of the ways, I would argue many of the ways that they operate, particularly with such things as DEI statements, and that DEI itself is far more interested in groups rather than individuals and their knowledge, but fine. I don't think DEI is a good thing to begin with. You've been around on this channel long enough, you know what I think of it. Despite good intentions, they have inhibited a legitimate array of viewpoints and opinions that a truly diverse academic community should prize. Yes, diversity of thought matters a crap ton more than anything else. But just as in the era of anti-red paranoia, government as such should restrain itself from squelching intellectual diversity, intimidating higher education leaders, and chilling the range of ideas and discourse that institutions dedicated to seeking truth and knowledge ought to keep sacrosanct. The sought-after solutions to speech stultifying problems of certain DEI initiatives, I would argue most of them, but anyway, are neither found in Congress nor in state legislatures, but within campuses themselves. What if said DEI stuff that has caused there to not be an array of viewpoints or respect for an array of viewpoints is so entrenched that it doesn't matter if you leave the university alone or not, it's not going to get any better? This is the question that I have in reading this article. Anti-Semitism and its sibling Islamophobia are serious problems on campuses right now. The integration of diversity and inclusion values in a manner that enhances the core knowledge-based mission of higher education is also a serious challenge. Diversity and inclusion cannot be the DEI versions of it. Cannot be that in the slightest. Both concerns directly intersect with free inquiry and expression, the first practical principle of any serious academic enterprise, careful, nuanced approaches if we are to successfully meet the moment. While last week's, I think this is the one with President Shafiq of Columbia, actually, was that testimony. While last week's congressional hearing focused on anti-Semitism at Columbia University, state legislative proposals predominantly target DEI. The extent is staggering. 84 bills have been introduced in 28 states and the U.S. Congress since the start of last year. 12 have been passed into law in Alabama, Florida, Idaho, North Carolina, North Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, and Wyoming. There's more coming, by the way. A key force in making this happen is the Manhattan Institute, which has written savvy model legislation focused on ending DEI offices and staff, eliminating mandatory DEI training and diversity statements, and ending admissions and hiring preferences based upon identity, all of which are good things, frankly, in my view, that they should be ended. Frankly, just by enforcing existing law, really, in the sense that, it would seem violations of the Civil Rights Act if you are hiring based upon identity. And I use identity in air quotes because, frankly, it's demographic characteristics, not really identity in the slightest. Mandatory DEI training and diversity statements always come with the stupid assumptions that you yourself may not share as being true. It requires having a belief in certain things that you may not share, and that's why they should be ended, because they don't actually support having a diversity of thought on the actual issues in question. So, not to mention they are quite possibly very unnecessary for a lot of different positions to have such statements be made. Fine. That approach has, for now, he's talking about the Stop Woke Act. Let's see. The conservative truism that state regulation will do more harm than good has somehow become uncomfortable for much of the political right. It is true to see that sometimes there is a reaction on the right, that you abandon the reduction of government for the sake of certain things you're interested in, but the left does it just as well. So, we have that kind of problem. Not that long ago, the University of Chicago's president, Robert Zimmer, was lucid on this. In opposing former President Trump's then anticipated 2019 executive order on campus free speech, and in prior testimony before the U.S. Senate, he warned of the dangers of establishing any precedent furnishing the state with a role in regulating campus speech policies and the inevitable government bureaucracy that would follow. Such a bureaucracy around campus speech would be at least detrimental to dissenting viewpoints as any in-house university speech committee, arguably more so as an instrument of official government. It leads directly to the Orwellian situation Judge Walker saw clearly. That's the judge that ruled on the Stop Woke Act out of Florida, by the way. Similarly, the irony is thick when the motivation to create a more inclusive campus climate leads to policies and practices that effectively squash diversity and open inquiry. Indeed, but what if the universities themselves are also doing that inadvertently? This is the thing. If the universities themselves are also doing it, well, okay, maybe at the same time the state is going to do it. The problem is, very, very hard to get out of at that point. And it is true that the state could end up doing that. Beyond legally unprotected speech, such as the incitement of imminent violence, harassment, or that which would satisfy the legal standards for creating a hostile environment, expression should not be compelled by requesting or requiring diversity statements of job candidates, restricted through speech codes, or chilled in academic discussion by dissuading the use of terms deemed harmful. Agreed. Absolutely agreed. There's a reason I'm very much against DEI statements, and it's because they're ideological litmus tests. There's a reason I'm against the mandatory DEI training, because it is based on ideological things that not all people would agree with necessarily, and you're kind of forcing the agreement of certain things. You should not be making hiring based upon demographic characteristics of people. So, when faculty morally disapprove of terms that 99.9% of Americans would find completely innocuous, expressly discouraging the use of such terms, they suppress the free and open discourse that should thrive in the classroom. Not just in the classroom, but anyway. To the extent that such practices proliferate, they further alienate higher education by fostering campus cultures that are bizarre and virtually unrecognizable against the experiences of everyday Americans. Over-the-top examples I have personally encountered involve dissuading terms including poor people, blind spot, landlord, and America. Leading political philosopher Daniel Allen gets it right in stating that, quote, DEI bureaucracies have been responsible for numerous assaults on common sense. Yes. But Allen is also right that these observations in no way erode the necessity of diversity and inclusion as fundamental values of educational institutions. Now, I want to stop there and make a point for a moment. James Lindsay has said this many times, in that we may share the same vocabulary, but not the same dictionary. There is no reason to believe that we have the same meaning of those words, diversity and inclusion, in these things. And oftentimes, DEI, in pursuit of those things, because there's so much of them, in fact, most of them are based on postmodernist kind of approaches to it, ends up being exclusive of anybody who disagrees. And hence the reason it doesn't actually foster real, genuine diversity at all, as most folks would like it. So it's just a point and note to make on that one. Robust engagement of diverse viewpoints in a climate in which all are encouraged and equipped to participate is an essential accelerant in the determination of good ideas from bad ones, a task that lies at the heart of any great university's mission. However, this issue is not for the state to solve. This is the question. And it's obviously this guy's opinion that it should not be the state. The state should not have any involvement at all. That is not entirely true because, unfortunately, you have public universities. I agree with private universities. The state pretty much has no say, or should have no say, really. But the public universities are different. They are funded by taxpayer dollars, and the boards of regents and the boards of trustees for those universities are often appointed by their state legislatures or by the state governors in question, and that is a very different thing. So the state is inherently involved whether you like it or not on that kind of thing. That said, should the public universities maintain some autonomy from their respective states? Yes, but they also have to be responsive to what that particular state wants because they are getting taxpayer dollars from their respective states if they're a public university. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of higher education leaders to stand up for true principles of free inquiry and expression. Doing so would diffuse the temptations of government overreach. That is the higher principle on which we must stand. I actually very much agree. I question whether or not they're actually going to do that. This is the problem. If they're not going to do that, then it doesn't fucking matter. What those particular higher education leaders are doing. It doesn't matter in the fucking slightest if they're actually not interested themselves in standing up for principles of free inquiry and expression. As I've talked about now a few times on this channel, what does that include? If your purpose of the university is the pursuit of the truth, well then what do you have to do with that? You have to hold accountable those who would restrict that particular mission, i.e. impeding the rights of others by, occupying buildings, by doing vandalism, by harassing people, all of those kinds of things that are not protected under the First Amendment. Which again, private universities are not technically bound by the First Amendment, but they generally try to stay within it. The Oscar-winning film Oppenheimer captures the fundamental tragedy of Robert J. Oppenheimer's life. Among them is the sad reality that he was unable to successfully appeal to any higher principle at all when testifying before the Atomic Energy Commission. For those charged with leading universities, it's worth asking ourselves why Hutchins succeeded where we currently fail. The University of Chicago did not fall to communist ideological takeover, nor was it subjected to government infringement. Hutchins stood his ground on the principle of free and open inquiry, a principle at the heart of what higher education is and should remain. It is well worth fighting for. Are we up for it? I mean, a lot of us are probably up for it. Again, are the administrators? Are the administrators of higher education that you're saying should be the ones to do this going to do it? And when they don't do it, what is the responsibility that we have as faculty? What is the responsibility of faculty, of staff, of students who do want it? This is the thing, because if administrators themselves are not interested, or are interested in the opposite mission, well, not the opposite mission, but a completely different mission for the university, all like social justice uber alles or something, then that's a failure. That's not living up to that particular principle, and that's an administration that is not interested in living up to that particular principle. So what do you do when universities fail at that, is the question that I have. Because if they do, well, what do you do? What do you do with it? And, I do think at some point there is a role for the state in its primary purpose, because the primary purpose of the government should be to make sure the rights of everyone involved are respected. It's not allowed to infringe upon those rights. The government's not allowed to infringe upon those rights themselves, but it does have a role in that state. But as I don't particularly want to make the government any bigger either, and I don't necessarily think the government should get dramatically involved, the only other thing I can think of is new institutions arise with the competition to do things that an ideologically driven university that doesn't hold to those principles that Professor Banout puts out here, it's that's the thing that will have to happen. You'd have to have more competition from new institutions. Or you do have to have state intervention. And I don't prefer that in the slightest. I think the new institutions part is probably the better option, that are not connected at all to the state, but are very dedicated to the ideas of free and open inquiry and academic freedom, to the point where, of course, the leadership makes certain that the rights of folks involved on the campus from very different perspectives are not infringed upon with that. But that's my thought. So there's the question of the day for all of you. When a university fails at its own mission and the administrators don't seem to be up to it or are entirely uninterested in holding to that principle of free and open inquiry that is argued for here, and again, I agree with it, what do you do? What should the response be from the state, from the public, from the faculty and staff themselves who are pissed off with the situation? Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.